The world first saw them on a quiet morning that began like any other. In the Pacific sky, something bright appeared, so bright that fishermen stopped their work and stared at the horizon. The clouds didn't move naturally that day. They twisted, folded, and opened like a curtain being drawn aside. Out of that shining crack in the sky, something vast came through. It wasn't a meteor. It wasn't a plane. It was something the world had never seen before. The air trembled as the shape descended. It glowed silver and gold, smooth like liquid metal, yet alive in a strange way. Birds scattered in panic. The ocean waves below bent away from its shadow. Within minutes, news channels across the globe were broadcasting the same thing. A flying structure the size of a city, hovering above the Pacific. People called it divine. They said it was a sign. More of them appeared. First one, then 5, then 10. They arranged themselves in the sky like a crown of light. From every nation, people watched with fear, awe, and hope. The beings who arrived spoke through light, through a voice that came from the air itself. It was calm, deep, and carried a strange warmth. They called themselves guardians. They said they came to heal the broken world, to lead humanity to a better order. At first, many believed them. The world had seen too many wars, too much division. People were tired of pain and corruption. These visitors seemed pure, untouched by human flaws. Governments sent signals of peace. Religious leaders fell to their knees. There were celebrations, songs, and tears. Some people built altars overnight. Others waited for miracles, but not everyone was blinded by faith. A few scientists, hidden in small observatories and underground stations, began to record the strange energy patterns coming from the ships. The light they emitted was not divine, it was measurable. The sound waves in their voice had patterns, codes, and frequencies that machines could analyze. It wasn't magic. It was technology. Still, the world moved fast toward worship. The visitors made their first demand 1 week after arrival. They said humanity must unite under their guidance. They declared all weapons forbidden. All independent armies disbanded. They promised to end hunger and disease if humanity obeyed. They used words like peace and harmony, but their light grew sharper with each command. When a small fleet of naval ships tried to approach one of their hovering vessels to investigate, they vanished in a flash of blue light. No explosion, no wreckage, just gone. The world froze. News stations replayed the last radar signals again and again. The voice of the so-called divinities came once more, calm as ever, saying, "They have been purified." That word, purified, spread like poison. Some nations began to surrender willingly. Their leaders said it was better to be ruled by gods than to be destroyed by them. Others tried to resist, but their weapons failed. Communications broke down. Power grids flickered. Cities went dark one after another. The invaders released beams that silenced entire regions without killing, as if cutting their will instead of their bodies. Faith turned into fear. People who once cheered now whispered prayers for survival. Churches, mosques, and temples overflowed with frightened crowds. The visitors did not destroy those places. They visited them. Their shining forms entered through ceilings like living light, and people bowed, believing their gods had come at last. The divinities smiled and said humanity had been chosen. Yet behind every word there was control. In hidden corners of the world, a different kind of movement began. Soldiers, engineers, scientists, and civilians gathered quietly. They didn't meet in the open. They used old radio channels, abandoned tunnels, and forgotten military bunkers. They didn't speak of gods. They spoke of survival. They analyzed the invaders' light, sound, and energy. And what they found was shocking. Those who called themselves divine were not from heaven. They were from another world, a species advanced, powerful, and ancient, but not perfect. Their ships were powered by a strange form of plasma, controlled by a living nervous system that mimicked thought. Their voices weren't spiritual, they were artificial. Everything they said about peace and order was a way to make humanity kneel. The underground teams began to map every signal the invaders sent. The data formed patterns, showing weak points in the energy grids that held their ships in the sky. But humanity had no weapon strong enough to reach them. Every missile, every laser, every aircraft failed before getting close. That's when an old whisper resurfaced, something from the forgotten corners of human history. Decades earlier, in the frozen lands of Antarctica, a secret research base had been built during the last great global conflict. It was meant to study energy fields and gravity waves, When peace came, it was abandoned, sealed under ice and silence. Only a few records mentioned it, but one of the scientists in the underground network remembered the name. It was there that humanity had once dreamed of building something impossible, a ship that could survive beyond the limits of Earth. Now that dream became a necessity. As the invaders tightened their control, the world's skies filled with their symbols. Massive structures began to appear in the clouds, glowing towers suspended by energy fields. They called them temples of renewal, claiming they would cleanse the Earth. No one knew what would truly happen once they activated. Fear spread faster than any weapon. People disappeared if they resisted. Broadcasts were replaced by the voice of the so-called gods, always calm, always reminding humanity that obedience meant salvation. But below the frozen surface of Antarctica, something was awakening. A handful of people reached the old base covered in layers of snow thicker than buildings. The entrance was sealed with rusted steel and frozen hinges. Inside were halls buried in ice and time, filled with machines left half-finished. The old power cores were dead. The air smelled like dust and metal. But there, at the heart of the facility, they found a massive frame, a ship unlike any built before. It was called the Revenant. It had never flown. It was meant to be the first of its kind, a warship powered by experimental energy that could bend gravity and space. The scientists who designed it had disappeared before finishing it, their research buried by politics and fear. Yet the blueprint remained. The survivors stared at the ship for a long time. They didn't speak of victory. They spoke of a chance, one last chance for humanity to prove it could stand. The energy readings from the invaders matched the data used to design the Revenant decades ago. It meant the ship might work, but it also meant it could kill everyone who tried to activate it. Outside, the world sank deeper into submission. The invaders began to rebuild cities into structures that looked like temples. They said the transformation would bring peace, but people started to vanish inside those glowing walls. No one came out. The voice of the so-called gods began to sound colder. Meanwhile, under the ice, sparks of blue light flickered in the dark halls. The humans worked day and night, using old tools and scraps of technology. Every screw, every wire was handled like a heartbeat. They didn't have time or resources, but they had will. They had anger. They had love for the world that was being stolen from them. Each time the invader's voice echoed through their underground speakers, declaring humanity's submission, someone in that frozen base whispered the same quiet answer: no. Weeks passed. The world above began to change in ways no one could have imagined. Skies glowed with strange colors. Oceans reflected lights that weren't from the sun. The alien fleet began to grow restless. Their leaders demanded full obedience, threatening purification of entire continents. Yet something in their tone sounded uncertain. They had seen strange signals from the South Pole, tiny, flickering bursts of human technology they thought long dead. They didn't know that deep beneath the ice, humanity's last hope was being born. The old reactors roared back to life, shaking the frozen tunnels. Steam and light filled the base as systems reactivated after decades of silence. Screens lit up with old data, and human hands worked faster than ever. The Revenant was incomplete, unstable, but it was the only weapon left. It didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to rise. And as the first tremors of its awakening echoed through the Antarctic ice, the stars above seemed to pulse, as if watching. The invaders who called themselves divine had no idea that humanity had learned more from its pain than any other species in the galaxy. They thought they had broken Earth's spirit. They didn't understand that every defeat, every loss, every wound had only taught humanity how to fight harder. They believed they were gods. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The light above the planet had changed. The skies no longer looked blue but were painted in pale silver, like the world was trapped under a giant mirror. The so-called Divinities had spread their ships across every continent. Their presence was constant, their voices calm and cold. Every city could hear them through the air, through screens, even through the sound of rain. They spoke of peace, but peace had become another word for silence. People were no longer free. Markets were empty, streets were quiet, and buildings stood like hollow shells of what they once were. The visitors had promised to end pain, but what they brought was stillness. The lights that shone from their floating towers watched over every movement. Machines moved across the streets, collecting people for evaluation. No one returned from that. Families whispered together at night, afraid of being heard by the walls. Humanity had become a quiet shadow under the rule of beings that claimed to be divine. Yet, far below the frozen south, the sound of machinery still echoed in secret. The underground base buried in Antarctica had come alive again. The air inside trembled with the hum of power. Sparks of light jumped across walls, illuminating faces tired but determined. They had reactivated the ancient engines that once powered the unfinished ship, called the Revenant. Every system that came online felt like a small victory. The people working there had no uniforms, no flag, and no rank. They came from different lands, speaking different languages, but now shared a single purpose: to bring back humanity's right to exist without chains. The leader among them stood near the main console, watching the data flow across the screens. The readings were unstable. The old reactor was powerful but unpredictable. It pulsed with light that seemed almost alive. The energy core was built using fragments of alien technology found decades ago during an earlier contact. Now that same knowledge had become humanity's final weapon. Outside the underground facility, the storm above raged endlessly. Blizzards howled like ghosts across the ice. The entrance to the base was buried so deep that even the invaders' sensors could not detect it. The world believed Antarctica was empty, frozen, lifeless, but under that silence, humanity was preparing its return. Communication with the rest of the world was almost impossible. Most satellites had been destroyed or captured by the enemy. Only one old frequency still worked, a shortwave radio line bouncing off the ionosphere. Through that faint signal, messages were sent in code. Each one carried small updates from hidden resistance groups across the globe. One message arrived from a destroyed city. It said that the invaders were building something near the equator, a massive structure reaching into the clouds. The people called it the Tower of Ascension. It was said to be the final phase of their plan. When completed, it would release a wave of energy that would permanently change human DNA, turning people into obedient servants. That message changed everything. The team under the ice realized they had little time left. The Revenant had to be completed before the tower was activated. Every second mattered. The engineers worked with shaking hands, some without sleep for days. The sound of metal being welded, circuits being replaced, and systems rebooting filled the tunnels. The smell of ozone and heat filled the air. They spoke softly to each other, not out of fear, but because silence helped them think. They were tired, hungry, and cold, but no one wanted to stop. The scientists studied every pulse from the alien fleet above. They noticed something important. The invaders' ships shared one central source of energy. If the main power node in orbit was destroyed, the entire fleet would lose its shield. But the node was heavily protected. Only something with the same or greater power could reach it. The Revenant, if fully activated, could. As the construction continued, memories of the old world haunted everyone there. Some remembered watching the first ship appear in the sky, how beautiful it had seemed. Others remembered losing families, homes, or freedom in the days that followed. They no longer worked just for revenge. They worked to protect what remained of being human. One night, while the storm raged above, the power in the base flickered. The entire hall shook. The energy core of the Revenant was reacting violently. The reactor released waves of light, flooding the room with a pulse that felt like thunder. Systems went offline for a moment, then came back. No one was hurt, but the readings showed something alarming. The reactor was alive in a way no machine should be. The old technology had fused human design with alien science. It didn't just generate power, it seemed to think. It adapted. That frightened some of the people. If it became unstable, it could destroy everything. But if they could guide it, it could become the weapon they needed. The choice was clear. They had to take the risk. As the days passed, they tested the smaller systems: navigation, thrusters, targeting. The ship was massive, built to survive the vacuum of space, yet graceful in its design. It had no windows, only dark armor that absorbed light. It looked like a piece of the night sky itself, shaped into steel. The first time the engines ignited, the ice above cracked for miles. The ground trembled as blue flames erupted from the launch chambers. Deep sensors across the world detected the energy spike. For a brief moment, the invaders' network registered a disturbance coming from the southern pole. But their analysts dismissed it as a natural event. They didn't imagine that humans could be building something capable of threatening them. Inside the base, cheers filled the air. The engines had worked. For the first time in years, someone laughed out loud. The sound felt strange, almost forgotten. The people who had lived under fear and silence were beginning to remember what hope felt like. The next step was the hardest, arming the ship. The Revenant was designed to use energy weapons beyond anything humanity had ever built. But the components were missing. The resistance groups across the world began to send whatever they could find. Scraps of metal, reactor parts, stolen data. It wasn't enough. Then one of the engineers suggested something bold, using the same type of energy that powered the invaders' smaller drones. Those drones patrolled the skies, scanning cities and capturing humans. Each one carried a small energy cell linked to the invaders' network. If they could capture even one of those cells, they could study it and adapt it to the Revenant systems. It was dangerous, but necessary. In a destroyed coastal city far from the ice, a small group of survivors managed to bring down one of the drones using old anti-air equipment. The battle lasted only minutes, but they succeeded. The damaged cell was smuggled through old shipping tunnels hidden in containers of frozen food, until it reached the Antarctic base. When they connected it to their systems, it worked. The alien power responded to human touch, adapting as if it recognized something familiar. It was as if the technology had always been meant for human hands. The Revenant systems began to stabilize. The hum of the ship grew stronger, deeper, more confident. Lights along its dark hull pulsed slowly like a heartbeat. It wasn't just a machine anymore, it was becoming a symbol, a living reminder that humanity wasn't defeated. But the invaders began to notice. Their sensors started picking up strange electromagnetic waves coming from the south. The voice of the so-called gods returned, echoing across the skies, warning humanity that rebellion was hopeless. They said resistance would only bring more pain. They said they were eternal, untouchable, divine. Those words no longer had power. The people in the underground base didn't bow or tremble. They listened, then kept working. They had learned the truth. The invaders were not divine. They were powerful, yes, but they bled, they feared, they made mistakes. Humanity had seen their weakness, and now they were preparing to strike. As the final systems of the Revenant came online, the old control room filled with light. The energy core stabilized, pulsing with quiet strength. The pilots took their places. The scientists activated the flight systems. Outside, the storm began to break. For the first time in months, sunlight touched the ice. The ship rose slightly from its cradle, the air trembling around it. The ground cracked, snow melted, and the wind howled. It wasn't a launch yet, it was a heartbeat. The first heartbeat of something that would change everything. The people watched in silence, tears in their eyes. They knew what this meant. Humanity was no longer hiding. It was preparing to rise. Far above, in orbit, the alien fleet adjusted its position. The Tower of Ascension neared completion. The so-called gods prepared to end human will forever. But they had no idea that beneath the frozen world, a ship built by human hands was about to rewrite the balance of power. The storm quieted. The engines cooled. The team inside the base stood together, watching the data scroll across their screens. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They all felt the same thing, a shared understanding that what came next would decide everything. And as the final sequence loaded, the light from the reactor dimmed and pulsed once more, like the calm breath before a storm. The world above thought humanity was finished. The Divinities believed they had conquered every heart, every nation. But in the silence under the ice, the first true weapon of humanity's spirit was ready to away. The night before the launch felt endless. The people inside the underground base didn't sleep. They sat near the glowing panels, checking every connection again and again. The air smelled of metal and heat. Each vibration of the reactor echoed through the frozen tunnels like a slow heartbeat. Outside, the wind howled across the Antarctic desert, but inside the base there was only silence and focus. They all knew what was coming. The Revenant was ready. Every system was connected, every control tested, every line of code verified. For the first time, the ancient warship built by human hands was alive. The team stood together, looking at the ship that filled the hangar like a sleeping giant. Its black hull absorbed all light, smooth and endless with faint blue lines running across its surface. It looked more like something born than built. The leader walked along the edge of the platform, stopping in front of the main control screen. The numbers were stable. The engine output was perfect. The shields were holding. They could launch within hours. Yet no one spoke of victory. They all understood what this meant. Once the Revenant took flight, the enemy would see it. And when they did, they would attack with everything they had. In the corner of the control room, a small screen flickered with a weak radio signal. A transmission had arrived from one of the last resistance groups still alive in the north. The message was broken and full of static, but one part was clear. The Tower of Ascension was almost complete. The invaders had gathered all their ships around it. They planned to activate it within 2 days. Once that happened, humanity would lose itself forever. The people under the ice exchanged quiet looks. 2 days was not enough time to prepare for a war, but it was all they had. They decided the Revenant would launch at dawn. It wasn't about being ready. It was about refusing to give up. When morning came, a pale light spread across the frozen sky. The storm had cleared, leaving the horizon glowing with gold and blue. The hangar doors slowly opened, releasing a wave of mist into the cold air. The ground trembled as the ship powered up. Ice cracked, snow melted, and a loud, deep hum filled the world. For a moment, the crew stood in silence, watching their creation rise. It was like seeing hope take form, heavy and alive, breaking free from the ground that had held it for so long. The engines roared, sending waves of energy across the ice fields. The snow rose like dust in a storm. The Revenant lifted higher, its shadow spreading across the white land. Then, with a flash of blue light, it vanished into the clouds. Across the world, every radar that still worked picked up the signal. The invaders detected it instantly. Their network trembled as unknown energy readings appeared from the South Pole. The voice of the so-called gods echoed across the sky, filled with surprise and anger. They demanded to know who dared to break their divine order. The world listened in fear. The invaders had never sounded uncertain before. Their light changed color, flickering between gold and red. It was the first sign of panic. In orbit, the alien fleet began to move. Their massive ships turned toward the south, charging their weapons. The Tower of Ascension slowed its construction. The Divinities had been challenged, and they would not ignore it. High above the clouds, the Revenant broke through the atmosphere. Its dark armor shimmered against the sunlight. Inside, the crew watched as Earth grew smaller below them. The silence of space surrounded them, broken only by the sound of the engines. For a moment, everyone forgot fear. They were no longer hiding under ice. They were rising for all of humanity. The first enemy scouts arrived minutes later. Sleek silver ships darted toward the Revenant, glowing with energy. The crew prepared the weapons. The ship's targeting system locked on, and beams of blue light erupted from its sides. The first shot tore through space like lightning. In a blink, the enemy ship exploded into dust. The invaders were not ready for that. Their technology had always been superior. No human weapon had ever been able to destroy them so easily. But this was different. The Revenant's weapons didn't just fire energy. They bent it, shaped it, turned the invaders' own power against them. The enemy tried to retreat and regroup, but the Revenant followed, moving faster than any human craft ever built. The ship danced through debris and light, firing with precision and silence. Each blast shattered another enemy vessel. On Earth, people saw flashes in the sky. They didn't know what they were, but some looked up and whispered that maybe, just maybe, humanity was fighting back. Inside the alien command ship, confusion spread. The so-called gods demanded answers. How could humans have created something capable of such power? How could a race they had judged weak stand against them? Their pride began to crack. The Revenant turned toward the fleet. Its sensors locked onto the main power node, the core of the invaders' control system. It floated like a black sun among the stars, surrounded by smaller ships. If that node fell, the entire network would collapse. But the crew knew what it meant to attack it. It would be suicide. The enemy defenses were too strong. Still, they had no other choice. The captain gave the signal. The engines flared, pushing the ship forward. The stars stretched as the Revenant charged toward the enemy formation. The first wave of attacks hit its shields. The ship shook violently, alarms ringing through the hallways. Sparks flew, metal groaned, but the shields held. Inside, the crew worked without panic. Every movement was calm, every command precise. They had prepared for this moment all their lives without knowing it. They were fighting not for glory, but for the right to exist as free people. The Revenant fired again, sending a beam of light that cut through the heart of the nearest alien ship. The explosion lit up space, scattering debris in every direction. The enemy returned fire, surrounding the human ship in waves of red and gold energy. The hull cracked, systems flickered, but the ship kept moving. One of the engineers shouted a warning: the reactor was overheating. If they didn't slow down, it could explode. But slowing down meant losing the fight. The captain made the choice. They would keep going. The ship dived through enemy lines, twisting and turning, dodging blasts of energy. Its armor glowed with heat. The crew could feel the vibration in their bones. The stars blurred around them. Ahead, the power node pulsed like a living heart. The alien command vessels formed a shield around it, but the Revenant didn't stop. The humans inside shouted commands, rerouted power, and poured every bit of energy into the main cannon. The reactor screamed and the air filled with light. Then the Revenant fired. The beam tore through space like a storm, striking the power node dead center. For a moment, everything went silent. Then light filled the void. The explosion spread in waves brighter than the sun. The alien fleet broke apart, their systems crashing. One by one, their ships began to fall. On Earth, people saw a sudden flash in the sky. The light spread across the horizon, turning night into day. The invaders' towers flickered, their symbols fading. The voices that had once declared divine order went silent. In the control room of the Revenant, alarms blared. The energy core was collapsing. The captain ordered an emergency shutdown, but it was too late. The reactor was unstable. If it exploded, it could destroy half of orbit. The crew looked at one another. No one spoke. They knew what they had to do. They redirected the ship away from Earth, guiding it toward deep space. The engines roared as the ship began its final flight. The heat inside grew unbearable. Systems shut down one by one, yet no one turned back. Through the viewing screens, they could see the alien fleet burning, their false gods falling. Humanity had done it. The people on Earth were free again. The ship drifted farther, glowing brighter as the reactor reached its limit. The captain closed his eyes, whispering something no one else could hear. The light grew stronger until the entire sky was white, and then it was gone. The Revenant disappeared into the void, leaving behind only silence and a faint shimmer of light. On Earth, people stared at the sky. The enemy was gone. The world was quiet. Slowly, hope returned. People came out of hiding, touching the ground, looking up and realizing the war was over. They didn't know the names of those who had fought. They didn't know where the ship had gone, but they knew what it meant. Humanity had not just survived, it had shown its strength. The so-called gods had come to rule, but they left defeated. And somewhere beyond the stars in the cold dark, the last echo of the human warship drifted through space, its light still burning like a heartbeat that refused to die. The world woke to silence. For the first time in months, the skies were clear. The golden lights that once hung over cities were gone. The massive ships that called themselves divine had vanished from sight. People stepped out of their homes, blinking at the real sunlight that touched their faces again. The air smelled of rain and earth instead of metal. The voice that had once ruled their minds no longer spoke. It was as if the heavens had gone quiet, leaving only the sound of wind and distant waves. At first, no one knew what had happened. Power grids slowly flickered back to life. Broken radios buzzed. Then a few messages began to appear, short, shaky transmissions from different parts of the world. Words like, "They're gone, it's over, and we're free," passed through the air. People cried, shouted, and fell to their knees, not out of worship but out of relief. The battle in space had lasted only hours, but its effect changed everything. The light that had filled the sky the night before had been seen by everyone. Some thought it was the end of the world. Others thought it was a miracle. No one knew it was the moment humanity took back its freedom. The alien fleet was gone, and the Tower of Ascension had stopped building itself. The floating temples crashed into the oceans and deserts, leaving only dust and twisted metal behind. But even in victory, there was no celebration. The cost was heavy. Entire cities had been lost. Millions had vanished, taken by the invaders and never returned. The people who had survived looked around at their broken world and realized that rebuilding it would be harder than any battle. In the frozen south, the place where the Revenant had been born was now silent. The tunnels under the ice were cracked and dark. The base had been destroyed by the launch and the shock waves that followed. Only a few data logs remained, showing fragments of what had happened. The world would never know the faces of the people who built the ship. They had disappeared along with it, swallowed by the light of their own creation. Still, the story began to spread. Rumors of a human warship that had risen from the ice reached every corner of the planet. Survivors whispered about a dark vessel that fought the gods and the stars. They said it was built by those who refused to kneel. Some called it legend, some called it truth, but everyone believed one thing: it was the work of humans, not gods. Months passed. The world tried to recover. Without the invaders' control, technology began to fail. The machines they had forced humanity to rely on shut down. Communication lines were weak and food was scarce. Yet people worked together. Neighbors helped neighbors. Farmers shared what little they had. Children played in the streets again. Humanity was wounded, but it was alive. Teams of scientists began searching the wreckage of the fallen alien ships. They wanted to understand how they worked, what made them so powerful. The strange metals and glowing cores were unlike anything on Earth. But hidden inside, they found something surprising: pieces of design that looked human. Not in shape, but in thought. It was as if the invaders had once been like humans long ago and had simply gone too far in their hunger for control. That discovery changed the way people saw their enemy. The invaders had believed they were perfect, untouchable, divine. But deep inside their technology, there were traces of weakness, of fear, of imperfection. It made humanity realize that the greatest strength of life wasn't in perfection. It was in the ability to grow, adapt, and care. Across the oceans, the world slowly united again. For the first time, there were no borders, no flags, and no leaders claiming power over others. The survivors met in small gatherings to share stories, trade supplies, and rebuild what they could. The memories of what happened were still raw. Every family had lost someone, yet there was a quiet pride among them, the pride of a species that had faced gods and survived. In one ruined city, a young mechanic found a piece of metal half buried in rubble. It was dark and smooth, with faint blue light still pulsing through it. No one knew where it came from, but when touched, it hummed softly like a living heartbeat. Some said it was a piece of the Revenant, a fragment of the ship that had saved them. The mechanic placed it in a small workshop, surrounded by tools and maps as a reminder that the warship had been real. The strange light from the fragment never faded. At night, it glowed softly, casting a calm blue color on the walls. People would come to see it not as a weapon, but as a symbol of what humans could do when they refused to surrender. Far beyond Earth, in the quiet darkness of space, something still moved. A small signal pulsed faintly in the void, barely strong enough to be noticed. It came from the edge of the solar system, where no one had ever been. The signal repeated every few hours, a heartbeat in the emptiness. It was weak, but it was human. Back on Earth, scientists detected it by accident while trying to restore the old satellite network. At first, they thought it was a mistake. Then they compared the data. The frequency matched the energy signature of the Revenant's reactor. The world held its breath. The warship had not been destroyed. The scientists tried to trace the signal, but it was too far away. It moved slowly, as if drifting. Some believed the ship's crew might still be alive, trapped in deep space. Others thought it was only an echo, a final message left behind. Either way, the idea gave people hope. Humanity hadn't just won, it had reached the stars. Years began to pass. The Earth healed. Forests grew back where cities had once burned. Oceans cleared. Without the invaders' interference, nature started to breathe again. The world that had been on the edge of collapse found new life. Children born after the war listened to stories about the time when the sky was filled with light and people believed gods had come. They listened wide-eyed as elders spoke of a ship built under ice, a ship that carried human courage into the heavens. They asked what happened to it, and the answer was always the same: it's still out there, watching over us. As peace returned, humans began rebuilding their technology, but this time, they did it differently. They remembered what the invaders had tried to teach, that power without compassion becomes control, and control destroys freedom. The new machines were built to serve, not to rule. Energy came from cleaner sources. Weapons were dismantled. For the first time, humanity learned from its own mistakes. Still, not everyone believed the war was over. Some scientists warned that the invaders might return one day. The universe was vast, and arrogance rarely dies quietly. They began preparing defenses not out of fear, but out of wisdom. If another threat ever came, humanity would be ready. They had already learned what it meant to face those who thought themselves gods. Decades later, Deep in an observatory on a mountain, a young observer sat alone, staring at the stars. The night sky was calm. Then, suddenly, one of the long-range sensors picked up a faint light moving across the edge of space. It wasn't a meteor or a satellite. It was too controlled, too steady. The observer watched as it blinked once, blue, then gone. He didn't say anything. He just smiled. Somewhere out there, the Revenant was still alive. Back on Earth, life continued. People rebuilt homes, planted crops, and rebuilt schools. They painted murals on broken walls. Images of the sky battle, of the ship rising from the ice, of the moment when humanity found its strength again. Those murals became reminders that even when everything seems lost, the human heart has a way of fighting back. The illusion of divinity had been shattered forever. The beings who once demanded worship had fallen to those they called weak. Humanity didn't need gods anymore. It had learned to trust itself. The world was quieter now, but it was a peaceful quiet. The kind that comes after a storm. The kind that lets people breathe again. Somewhere under the stars, beyond the reach of sight, a ship drifted silently. Its dark hull reflected the distant glow of suns. Inside, faint light still flickered, systems still alive, perhaps waiting for a signal, perhaps dreaming in the dark. The Revenant had done its duty. It had reminded the universe that humanity was not meant to kneel, and though no one on Earth could hear it, the ship's core still pulsed softly, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. A reminder to all who might come after. Humanity may fall. It may suffer, but it will always rise again. The years rolled forward like quiet waves. Time softened the pain of the past, but the scars never disappeared. Monuments rose in memory of those who had fallen. In the ruins of old cities, people planted gardens. Where glass towers once stood, now stood trees and flowers. Humanity had begun to heal, not just the land, but its own spirit. Children who had never seen the war grew up under blue skies and real stars. They didn't know the voice that once called itself divine or the fear that silenced billions. They only knew stories told by their parents and grandparents. Stories of light in the sky, of bravery in the cold, and of a ship that carried human courage beyond the stars. In schools, teachers spoke of the day of the awakening. It was no longer remembered as a day of terror, but as the day humanity remembered what it truly was. Paintings and songs told the story of the ship born beneath the ice, the warship that defied gods. Some called it a myth, others a miracle, but everyone agreed it was the turning point that changed everything. The world had entered a new age. Energy came from clean sources. Machines were built with care, not greed. There were still governments, but they worked together more than ever before. The memory of how close humanity came to being enslaved again made them cautious. They argued, they disagreed, but they never forgot the price of division. In one of the rebuilt cities, a group of engineers gathered in a quiet laboratory. Their faces were young, but their eyes carried the same fire as those who once built the warship. They studied the fragments of alien metal and the blue shard that was believed to be from the Revenant. They were not trying to build weapons. They were trying to understand. One of them placed their hand on the glowing shard and whispered softly, "You fought for us. Now we'll learn from you." Over the years, their research led to breakthroughs that changed human technology forever. New materials that could heal themselves, energy systems that never ran out, ships that could move between planets faster than ever before. Humanity was no longer trapped on Earth. It was preparing to step into the stars again. But every time they spoke of expansion, the old generation grew quiet. They remembered the ones who had come from the stars before and claimed to be gods. They remembered how easily such power could corrupt. They warned the young not to forget humility. Even so, curiosity is part of the human heart. Exploration called to them. Not for power, not for conquest, but for understanding. They wanted to know what was out there, what waited in the deep silence. One day, a signal appeared again. The same faint heartbeat that scientists had found years ago, pulsing from the edge of the solar system. But this time it was stronger. It was moving closer. The world held its breath. News spread fast, every communication network, every station, every home. People stopped what they were doing and listened. Some cried, some prayed, some smiled. The signal matched the energy of the Revenant exactly. Satellites picked it up clearly now. The reading showed a massive object entering the outer edge of the system, moving at a steady pace. No one knew if it was alive, damaged, or guided by someone or something. The people waited, their hearts full of both fear and hope. Weeks passed. The signal grew stronger. Then one morning, telescopes caught sight of it, a shape moving slowly through the blackness. A dark ship, scarred and battered but unmistakably human. The Revenant had returned. When the image was shown to the world, silence followed. Then cheers erupted. Cities stopped working for an entire day as everyone watched the skies. Humanity had once again touched the stars, and the stars had answered back. But as the ship drew closer, strange readings began to appear. Its systems were active, yet there was no sign of a living crew. The frequencies it emitted were complex, almost like language, but not quite. Scientists tried to decode it, but failed. It was as if the ship itself had learned to think. When it finally reached Earth's orbit, it didn't land. It stayed above the clouds, circling silently as if watching. Its black hull reflected the sunlight, and the faint blue glow from its engines painted the sky at night. People looked up and whispered, "It's home." Messages were sent, signals transmitted in every possible code. The ship responded with a single repeating pulse, slow and calm. Then it went silent again. Some believed the ship was waiting for orders. Others thought it was guarding Earth. A few feared it might no longer recognize humanity. But most saw it as a protector, a reminder that their strength was still out there. Days turned into months, and the ship remained in orbit, unmoving. Scientists and pilots begged for permission to approach, but the world's leaders decided to wait. They wanted to understand before acting. Humanity had learned patience. One night, the blue glow around the Revenant flared brighter. For the first time since its return, it sent out a message. The signal was not in words, but in images, flashes of light and sound that formed patterns. When decoded, it showed fragments of space far beyond the solar system. Images of broken worlds, shattered fleets, and strange signals from distant regions. It was a warning. Something was coming. The images ended with a symbol, one that humanity remembered all too well. The emblem of the divine invaders. It meant they were not gone. They were rebuilding somewhere in the far reaches of the galaxy. Fear returned, but it was not the same kind of fear as before. It was steady, quiet, and determined. Humanity had faced gods once and survived. If they came again, they would be ready. The world's nations came together once more, forming the first true planetary council. Scientists, soldiers, and thinkers worked side by side to prepare. The Revenant's technology was studied carefully. It became a guide, a teacher. People no longer built temples for gods. They built docks for ships, not for war, but for defense and discovery. The dream of space, once filled with fear, now burned with purpose. Years later, when the new fleet finally launched, every ship carried the same mark, a blue star wrapped in a circle. It wasn't a flag of conquest. It was a promise that humanity would never be enslaved again. The first ship to leave Earth after the Revenant's return was named Hope's Echo. It wasn't large or armed. It was a scout ship, meant to search for the truth behind the warning. As it rose through the clouds, the people below watched and whispered blessings. The world had changed. They were no longer running from gods, they were reaching for the stars as equals. In the quiet night after the launch, an old man sat by a window, watching the blue light of the Revenant in the sky. He had survived the First War, had seen the world fall and rise again. He smiled softly and whispered, "We learned, didn't we?" The ship above remained still, glowing gently as if listening. The new generation would never know the terror of the old days. They would only know the strength that came after. The Revenant's shadow on the clouds became a symbol of courage. People wore it on their clothes, painted it on walls, and spoke of it in stories. Even children, when afraid, would say, "The Revenant watches us." It wasn't a prayer. It was comfort. The world no longer believed in divinity, but it had found something greater, unity. Humanity had finally understood that power did not come from ruling others, but from standing together. And as the years passed, the Revenant remained above, quiet and steadfast. Some said it would one day awaken again when humanity truly needed it. Others said it was already awake, silently guarding, waiting for the next storm. But no matter what people believed, one truth stayed the same. The gods had fallen, and humanity had risen. Not with arrogance, not with hate, but with the quiet strength that comes from knowing who you are. The illusion of divinity had ended long ago. What remained was something far greater, the spirit of humankind, unbroken, unyielding, and eternal. And somewhere, in the heart of that silent ship above the clouds, a soft light pulsed once more, a heartbeat, a reminder that even when the stars fall silent, humanity will never stop rising. Decades passed, and the Revenant still floated above Earth like a silent guardian. Its dark shape was a familiar sight in the sky, glowing faintly blue at night. Children grew up seeing it and never feared it. To them it wasn't a weapon or a mystery. It was a part of their world, like the moon or the stars. Humanity had changed more in those decades than in the 1,000 years before. The scars of the old war were gone, but the lessons remained. Cities were cleaner, powered by energy that didn't harm the world. People no longer built walls between nations. There were still disagreements, still mistakes, but the hate that once divided them had faded. The memory of the invaders who once called themselves divine had become history, taught in schools, remembered in quiet museums. Yet no one forgot how close the world had come to being lost. Every year, on the day the Revenant returned, people lit blue lights in their windows and stood in silence for 1 minute. Not in sorrow, but in gratitude, for the ship that saved them and for the courage that lived in their hearts. But peace never stays forever. One morning, deep space sensors picked up something strange. A faint energy ripple from beyond the solar system. At first it was dismissed as cosmic noise, but when the data repeated in a pattern, slow, deliberate, scientists grew quiet. The signal was almost identical to the one the Revenant had sent years ago, the one that warned of danger. It was happening again. The council met quickly. The Revenant had been silent for many years, only glowing softly in the sky. But as soon as the new signal was detected, the blue light around the ship brightened. For the first time in decades, its engines stirred. The orbit shifted slightly, and every radar on Earth caught it. People watched from every corner of the world as the sky lit up. The Revenant moved slowly at first, then faster, its engines glowing like fire. It wasn't leaving orbit. It was positioning itself between Earth and the deep black of space. It was protecting. No one had to be told what it meant. The ship that once fought the gods was waking up again. In a mountain observatory, a young astronomer stared at the readings. She whispered to herself, "It's answering the call." The signal from deep space was still coming, growing stronger. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It was something moving. Far beyond Pluto, telescopes saw the faint shimmer of light. Many small objects, traveling together, heading toward the solar system. It wasn't an army, not like before. It was a scouting fleet, a test. Someone out there wanted to see if humanity was still weak, but humanity was not the same anymore. The council didn't panic. They sent calm orders to the orbital stations. They activated the defense systems built from the Revenant's blue technology. And then, for the first time, they spoke directly to the ship above. A transmission was sent. "Revenant, this is Earth Command. If you can hear us, we are ready." For a moment, there was silence. Then the blue glow on the ship pulsed once, twice. Every monitor on Earth flickered at the same time. A voice, not of a person, but of something old and gentle, spoke through the signal. "We hear you." It wasn't the voice of a machine. It sounded human, warm, calm, almost kind. The world froze. The Revenant had spoken. The scientists and engineers exchanged stunned looks. They tried to send questions, but the ship continued speaking. "Long ago we were built to fight for survival. Now we fight to protect life," the signal cut. Then the ship's engines ignited, brighter than ever before. The clouds beneath it swirled from the energy. Slowly it began to rise higher, leaving Earth's orbit. People watched as the light grew smaller, heading toward the edge of space where the threat approached. Children pointed at the sky, cheering. Elderly people cried softly, remembering the first time they saw that light decades ago. Once again, the Revenant carried humanity's hope beyond the stars. Days turned to weeks as the ship traveled outward. Drones followed at a distance, sending images back. They showed the ship moving with silent grace, its armor glowing faintly like a living thing. Then, finally, it met the incoming fleet. The cameras caught only brief flashes, streaks of blue and white light colliding in the darkness. The invaders' ships were smaller, sleek, fast, but they were nothing like the vast divine fleets of the past. They were testing the waters. In minutes it was over. The Revenant cut through them like wind through smoke. No explosions reached Earth, only data, signals showing the invaders' ships scattering, their engines burning out one by one. Then the feed went dark again. For 2 days there was silence. People waited, prayed, hoped. Then on the third day, the blue light appeared once more in the sky. The Revenant had returned. It settled into orbit again, silent and steady. But this time something was different. The blue glow on its surface pulsed in rhythm, like a heartbeat. And then, across every screen on Earth, a message appeared. Not from the Council, but from the ship itself. Humanity is not alone. Others still watch. Some with fear, some with envy. But know this, you are ready. The message ended. For weeks, no one spoke of anything else. What did it mean by others still watch? Were there more civilizations hiding in the dark? Was the universe full of watchers waiting to see if humanity would rise or fall again? The truth didn't matter as much as what the message made people feel. Hope. Humanity realized it was no longer just defending Earth. It was now part of something much larger. The stars were no longer places of fear, but of possibility. Years later, the first interstellar ship built entirely by humans launched from orbit. It wasn't made for war. It was made to explore. On its hull, painted in glowing blue, was a simple phrase, "We remember the Revenant." The ship's crew looked out at the stars with calm determination. They weren't gods, and they didn't want to be. They just wanted to learn, to connect, to build something that lasted. As it left orbit, it passed close to the Revenant. The two ships drifted together for a few moments. The lights on the old warship flickered, as if nodding in farewell. Then the new ship engaged its engines and vanished into the black, leaving Earth behind. The Revenant stayed behind, silent as ever. Its purpose was not to travel now. It was to watch, to guard, to ensure the past never repeated itself. Decades turned into centuries. Humanity spread across nearby stars, building colonies, meeting new species, sharing knowledge. But no matter how far they went, they carried a piece of home with them. The belief that no one is divine, that all life deserves freedom. And in every colony, in every outpost, there stood a small blue light glowing softly at night, a reminder of the ship that first showed them who they were. The story of the Revenant became legend. Children on distant planets heard tales of the day humanity defied the gods. They didn't know the fear of that time, only the courage. And still, somewhere in orbit around the quiet blue world called Earth, the Revenant continued to shine. One evening, a storm rolled over the oceans and lightning flashed across the sky. For a brief moment, the light from above reflected off the waves, making it look as if the heavens themselves were bowing. The ship hovered there, its engines whispering softly through the clouds, patient and eternal. If one listened closely, they could almost hear it, the faint hum of power, steady and calm. A heartbeat. It was a symbol not just of survival, but of identity, a silent promise that no matter what the future brought, humanity would never again kneel before those who called themselves divine. In the darkness between stars, whispers traveled. Some alien civilizations spoke of a world that had risen from the ashes and dared to fight gods. Others warned each other not to provoke the species from the blue planet. The message was clear across the galaxy. Humanity remembers. Humanity endures. Humanity rises. Back on Earth, long after the stars of the old war had faded, a new generation stood beneath the sky. They looked up at the faint blue glow and smiled. They didn't need to see the battle to believe the story, because the truth was not in the weapons or the ship or the war. It was in the people who refused to surrender, the people who believed that no one, no matter how powerful, has the right to rule over others. And so even as centuries turned to millennia, the Revenant remained a symbol of that belief. A monument to the moment when humanity stood alone before gods and said, no. The stars would always remember, the universe would always remember, and humanity, humble, flawed, fearless humanity, would forever carry that light forward, shining bright enough to remind creation itself that strength is not in perfection, but in the courage to rise again and again. Even gods, if they still existed, would look upon that blue planet and know the truth. Humanity was never meant to bow. It was meant to stand.